Arthur Whitmore had built an empire from nothing, commanded boardrooms that made grown men sweat, and turned silence into a weapon sharper than anything money could buy. But on the evening we meet him, he is sitting in a garden in the rain, staring at legs that no longer obey him, and a 7-year-old girl he hasn't noticed yet is about to change everything he thought he knew about power, faith, and what it actually means to heal. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The rain started slow that evening, the way it always does in late October. A few drops first, tapping the stone garden path like a warning nobody asked for. Then more. Then the kind of steady, quiet downpour that doesn't stop for hours. Arthur Whitmore didn't move. He sat in his wheelchair at the center of the back garden, right where the old oak tree met the walking path he used to take every morning before dawn. His hands rested on his thighs, not gripping, not restless, just still. His silver hair was damp against his forehead. His wool blazer darkened at the shoulders. He didn't call for anyone. He didn't will himself inside. He just sat there, staring at the ground beneath his feet like he was trying to remind himself it existed. From a second-floor window, one of the housemaids watched him for almost 10 minutes before finally deciding to bring an umbrella. When she reached the garden, she held it out without a word. Arthur didn't look at her. "Leave it," he said quietly, "and go inside." She left the umbrella on the armrest and walked away quickly. He pushed it off. It hit the stone path and stayed there. From a distance, Arthur Whitmore looked like what he was, the kind of man who had always gotten exactly what he wanted. The Whitmore estate sat on 18 acres north of the city, 3 stories of old stone and newer glass, surrounded by gardens designed by a landscape firm he'd hired and then fired twice before approving the final version. Inside the house were original paintings, a wine cellar that had been stocked by a sommelier, a home office where multiple companies had been built or destroyed, depending on your perspective. His name had appeared on financial lists for nearly 2 decades, the kind of lists people pretended not to care about and then memorized anyway. Arthur Whitmore didn't chase recognition. He never spoke to journalists willingly. He didn't own a yacht or throw parties. He built things, then leveraged them. That was the whole story, or it had been. Now he sat in a garden in the rain because walking inside required someone's help, and Arthur Whitmore had never been built for asking. The accident happened 18 months ago, though Arthur had stopped counting by week somewhere around month 4. He had been driving home from a late meeting. Not unusual. He drove himself often. One of the few things he still did alone in a life otherwise populated by staff and advisors, and people whose purpose was to manage proximity to him. The road was empty. The weather had been clear. The police report said his vehicle struck a concrete divider at speed after the steering column locked. Mechanical failure, they concluded. A freak malfunction in a car that had been serviced 3 weeks prior. The impact threw him forward. His spine absorbed the violence of it in a way that could not be undone. He'd woken in a hospital room to Dr. Klein's careful, practiced expression, the face of a man who had learned to deliver catastrophic information without flinching. Incomplete spinal injury, the doctor had said. T10 level. There is some retained signal, which is encouraging, but recovery at this point, a breath. At this point, we manage expectations. Arthur had said nothing. He'd stare at the ceiling for a long moment, and then asked when he could have his phone back. That was who he was, or had been. The man in the garden now was something else. Something quieter and more jagged at the same time. He still ran the company. Calls, emails, video meetings in which he appeared from the chest up, so people could pretend the wheelchair wasn't there. He still made decisions. He still fired people when warranted. But there was something corroded behind his eyes that hadn't been there before. A bitterness that went past his injury, past his frustration. Something that had been there, maybe for years, and had finally found the right conditions to surface. He turned his head slightly and looked at his legs. Just looked, the way you look at something you used to own. Then he gripped the armrests and turned himself back toward the house. Lena Brooks arrived just past 7:30 the next morning, before the kitchen staff had finished breakfast prep. She let herself in through the side entrance the way she always did, folded her umbrella into the stand near the door, and tied her apron before she'd even set down her bag. She'd worked in the Whitmore house for almost 2 years. She was thorough and quiet, and she did not ask questions she didn't need the answers to. Beside her, moving in the careful way of a child who has learned to keep herself small in other people's spaces, was her daughter. Nia was 7. She had her mother's careful eyes, dark and steady, the kind that took in more than they let out. Her hair was pulled into 2 puffs on either side of her head, and she carried a small backpack with a sun and cloud patch sewn onto the front. She held her mother's hand until they were inside, then let go and looked around slowly, the way she always did the first few minutes of every visit, as if the house might be slightly different than the last time, and she needed to account for the changes. Lena had brought her today because her regular caregiver had called out and the center didn't open until 9. It wasn't the first time Nia had come along. The house was large enough that a child could stay out of the way without trying hard, and Nia was not the kind of child who created trouble. She was the kind of child who watched. Stay in the kitchen or the sitting room, Lena told her, smoothing the front of her apron. Don't go upstairs. Don't go toward Mr. Whitmore's study. And don't bother anyone. Nia nodded. She had heard some version of this speech every time she came. Can I go in the garden? If it's dry. Check first. Nia set her backpack on the bench near the window and walked quietly to look outside. The stone path was still damp, but the sky had cleared. She went to get her jacket. She found it by accident. She had been walking along the garden path, not the back garden where she knew he sometimes stayed, but the side path near the greenhouse, where herbs grew in long wooden planters. She was looking at them, touching the leaves of something that smelled like lemon, when she heard the sound. A mechanical hum, and then a sharp clack, the kind of sound a wheelchair makes when one will catches a raised edge of stone. She turned the corner and saw him. Arthur was trying to move forward along the path, but the right wheel had lodged itself against a raised seam in the flagstone. He was pushing with both arms, not saying anything, jaw tight, and the chair was rocking without going forward. His arms were strong, visibly so, the kind of strength that builds when your legs stop working and your arms carry everything. But the angle was wrong, and the wheel wouldn't clear the edge. Nia stood still for a moment, watching. Then she walked forward and reached for the back handle of the chair. I'll help. Don't touch it. His voice came out sharp. Not a shout, but the kind of low, controlled sound that carries the same weight. He didn't look at her. Go inside. Nia's hand dropped. She took one step back. Her expression didn't crumble the way another child's might. She just looked at him steadily for a second and then said, the wheel is stuck on the stone part that's raised up. If you back up a little first and then go sideways, it'll clear. A pause. Arthur looked at her then, actually looked, which he hadn't done before. She was small and unreadable and completely unbothered by the fact that he had just snapped at her. He backed the chair up 2 inches, angled it left, and rolled forward. The wheel cleared. He didn't say thank you. He moved past her without a word, toward the back of the garden. Nia watched him go. Then she went back to touching the lemon herb. By mid-morning, the staff had learned to move with extra care. Arthur had already sent his breakfast back twice. Once because the eggs were the wrong temperature, and once because someone had placed a newspaper on the tray without being asked, and he didn't want to look at it. He'd called his assistant 3 times in 45 minutes with corrections to documents that had already been reviewed. When the housekeeper, a steady woman named Mrs. Prescott, brought him a revised schedule for the week, he'd gone through it and crossed out 2 entries without explanation before handing it back. Lena moved through the rooms quietly, cleaning methodically, keeping her eyes on the task in front of her. She had learned early on how to read the temperature of the house, when to speak, when to disappear, when to make herself useful without being visible. Today, the temperature was low and sharp, and she kept Nia updated on it through small signals, a look here, a slight head shake there. Nia, for her part, had migrated to the sitting room, where she was drawing in a notebook she'd brought. She was drawing the greenhouse plants from memory, which kept her occupied and still, and therefore safely invisible. Dr. Klein arrived at 1 in the afternoon. He was a precise man, trim, always on time, never 2 words when one would do. He and Arthur had an arrangement that was less doctor and patient and more transaction. Arthur submitted to the assessments. Klein delivered the data. Neither pretended the other's company was enjoyable. Lena stayed near the hallway, polishing the credenza outside the study door. She could hear fragments, the deep register of Klein's voice, then Arthur's. Controlled first, then not. Statistically impossible. Klein's voice, flat and even. A pause. Then Arthur, say that again. The window for significant recovery at this injury level. Realistically, we're past it. I know that isn't what. I didn't ask what you know. Arthur's voice had gone quiet in a way that was worse than if he'd been yelling. I asked you to tell me what the options are. I've outlined them. The experimental program in Berlin requires candidacy criteria you don't fully meet. The stem cell protocol is still in phase 2. Everything else is management, not reversal. A breath. Arthur, I think it's time we talk seriously about long-term adaptive. Get out. Lena stepped back from the credenza. She heard the study door open from the inside. Not slammed, just pulled open with enough force to announce itself. And Dr. Klein walked out holding his briefcase with the quiet, unhurried pace of a man who had anticipated this outcome. He nodded at Lena briefly as he passed. She nodded back. From a study, nothing. Silence. She went back to the credenza and continued polishing. Victor Hale arrived at 4 without calling ahead, which meant either he owned the right to do that or he believed he did. Lena let him in. He was polished in the way expensive suits made people look polished, the fabric doing most of the work. He smiled at her as she took his coat, one of those smiles that was careful and warm in a way that made her trust it less than if it had been cold. Arthur's in the study, she said. Of course he is. Victor patted her arm once, the kind of gesture that was technically friendly and somehow wasn't, and walked through. Lena folded his coat slowly. Then she walked back toward the hallway, staying near the kitchen corridor, hands busy with a dish towel she'd picked up. She wasn't listening on purpose, but the house was quiet and sound carried. Victor's voice first. I've had the new documents prepared. The restructuring language is cleaner this time. 2 signatures and the transition arrangement is finalized. Arthur, I haven't reviewed them. You have everything you need. The lawyers have been over it. It's clean. I said I haven't reviewed them. A pause. Then Victor, his voice slightly different, softer, more careful in a way that somehow felt less reassuring. Arthur, you need to think about timing here. If something were to happen, nothing is happening. You can't predict. Victor, flat and final. Send me the documents. I'll read them when I read them. Footsteps. Then Victor's voice again, quieter, in a register that wasn't meant to carry as far as it did. We're running out of time to do this the easy way. Nia was sitting at the kitchen table when Lena came back in. She looked up from her notebook. Who was the man with the coat? Someone who works with Mr. Whitmore. He has a fake smile. Lena looked at her daughter for a moment. Then she went to the sink and turned on the tap. Finish your drawing. I'm finishing it. Nia turned the notebook around so her mother could see. A careful, slightly lopsided sketch of the greenhouse shelf. Every plant labeled in her own invented spelling. Manga. What's timing mean when grown-ups say it like a warning? Nia. I heard them talking about timing and insurance. In the hallway part. Lena turned off the tap. She walked over and sat across from her daughter, keeping her voice low. You weren't supposed to be in the hallway. I wasn't. I was in the sitting room. The door was open. I wasn't trying to hear. Lena looked at her for a long moment. Nia looked back, patient and steady. Don't repeat what you hear in this house, Lena said quietly. To anyone. You understand? Nia nodded. Is Mr. Whitmore okay? Lena stood up. That's not our business. But Nia was already looking toward the doorway that led to the hall. Her expression the way it got sometimes, a kind of still listening quality, like she was receiving information from a frequency other people couldn't quite tune to. She found him in the garden again near dusk. She hadn't meant to. She'd gone to return the umbrella that one of the staff had asked her to bring back to the garden bench. And there he was, near the far end of the path, parked and still. The light was going sideways through the oak tree, long amber lines across the stone. He didn't notice her at first. His head was bowed. His shoulders, which were always tight and set, had dropped slightly. His hand was pressed flat against his chest. And his face, which Lena had once described to Nia as the kind of face that never quite let you know what it was thinking, was simply open, not angry, not controlled, just a face that belonged to someone in pain and wasn't trying to hide it in that particular unobserved moment. He was crying quietly, not falling apart. Arthur Whitmore wouldn't allow falling apart. Just a few tears, the kind that escape when the rest of you has been working too hard to hold everything in place. Nia stood at the edge of the path, very still, and watched. She didn't approach. She didn't say anything. After a moment, she set the umbrella quietly on the bench and went back inside. That night, Lena was gathering her things near the side entrance when Nia tugged her sleeve. Manga. Nia was quiet for a second, her small face thoughtful. I think he's hurting more inside than his legs. Lena stopped zipping her bag. She looked at her daughter. He was crying, Nia said simply. In the garden, when nobody was there. People don't cry like that from their legs. Lena didn't answer right away. She finished zipping the bag and helped Nia into her jacket. She turned off the kitchen light. And as they stepped out into the cool evening air, she said quietly, almost to herself, No, baby. Usually they don't. The weeks that followed were the kind that passed without announcing themselves. Arthur continued his treatments, a rotation of therapists, specialists, and wellness consultants that he'd assembled over the previous year the way a man assembles a legal team, thoroughly and without optimism. There was a physiotherapist who came 3 mornings a week, a pain management specialist who arrived on Wednesdays, a neurologist who had been recommended by 2 different people Arthur trusted, which meant he trusted her slightly. None of them had anything new to say. They said it in different ways, with different charts and updated terminology, but the information underneath was the same. We are managing this, not reversing it. Arthur didn't break down in front of any of them. He answered questions clearly, followed protocols, and dismissed them without warmth when sessions ended. He had tried a clinic in Switzerland 2 months before, flying out on a Tuesday and returning by Friday, something in his expression on that return that the staff had learned not to ask about. He was, in the plainest terms, a man running out of doors to open. Nia started coming back on her own. Not daily. Lena worked 3 or 4 days a week in the house, and Nia only came along when the childcare situation required it. But when she did come, she found her way to wherever Arthur was with an ease that suggested she had simply decided it was allowed. The first few times, Arthur reacted the way he had in the garden, brief, dismissive, pointing elsewhere with his eyes if not his words. Nia absorbed this without visible hurt and rerouted slightly, staying within proximity without forcing presence. She learned where he took his late morning coffee. She learned the pace of the household, which rooms he preferred, how long he stayed in one place before needing to move. She was 7 years old and already naturally fluent in the language of making herself acceptable in a space. The 3rd week, she sat on a low stone bench near the garden door while Arthur was parked in his usual spot by the oak tree. She didn't speak for almost 20 minutes. She just drew in her notebook. Eventually, Arthur said, without looking at her, "What are you drawing?" "The tree," Nia said. "The bark has different shapes in it. Some of them look like faces." He looked at the tree. Then he said, "That one near the low branch looks like a man frowning." Nia looked at it. "I thought that one looked like a fish." "It doesn't look like a fish. It could be both." Arthur looked at her. She was drawing again, her tongue pressed slightly to the corner of her mouth the way children do when they're concentrating. He didn't say anything else, but he didn't send her away either. By the 4th week, something had shifted in small ways. Not in Arthur's manner toward the staff. He was still sharp, still demanding, still the kind of presence that made people move faster and speak in lower voices. But when Nia was in the garden, the sharpness seemed to find somewhere else to go. He didn't perform warmth. He wasn't built for that. But he answered her questions when she asked them, and he stopped sending her away. She asked him things no adult would. Not from boldness, just from the uncomplicated logic of childhood. She wanted to know something, so she asked, "Why do you always face the tree and not the flowers?" "Because the flowers change. The tree doesn't." Nia thought about this for a moment. "My grandma says things that don't change are either dead or stubborn." Arthur's mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but in the direction of one. "Your grandmother sounds like a difficult woman. She says she's just experienced." It was a Wednesday, warm for the season, when Nia asked the question that arrived like something dropped from a height. They had been quiet for a while. Arthur was looking at his phone, not really reading anything, more using it as an excuse for not having to be present in the moment in any accountable way. Nia had put her notebook away and was watching a beetle make its way across the garden path with the dedicated attention children give to small creatures. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "have you ever asked God to help you?" He looked up. She was still watching the beetle, asking the question the way she might ask if it was going to rain. Arthur's first instinct was to end the conversation, a brief, dismissive answer that would close the subject without being unkind. He was a man who had built things, real things, revenue and leverage and outcomes. The idea of supplication, of bending your knee towards something invisible and untested, had never made room for itself in the architecture of how he operated. "No," he said. "How come?" "Because it doesn't work that way." Nia looked at him now, direct and unperturbed. "How does it work? You earn what you get or you don't get it. There's no asking." She tilted her head slightly. "But you ask doctors. Doctors are real. They can't fix your legs, though." She said it simply, without cruelty, just observing. "You've had a lot of doctors." Arthur looked at her for a long moment. The beetle had made it to the other side of the path. A bird called somewhere in the oak tree. "Were you 7 years old?" he said finally. 7.5, Nia said. "And almost 8. 7.5. He looked back at his legs. "Go bother someone else." "I'm not bothering you. We're talking." He didn't respond to that, but he didn't ask her to leave. A few days later, she told him about the prayers. She didn't announce that she was going to. She was simply sitting nearby while Arthur was going over some documents his assistant had brought out to the garden. Physical papers, the kind that came when something needed a real signature. And between his reviewing one page and picking up the next, she said, "Sometimes when Mama is really worried about something, like when the car had that noise and we didn't have money yet, I pray." Arthur kept his eyes on the document. And she got extra hours that week. And then the car thing turned out to be a loose part and the man didn't charge her full price. Coincidence? Maybe, Nia said agreeably. But it felt like an answer. Feelings aren't evidence. My teacher says evidence is when something keeps happening. It keeps happening. Arthur set down the document. He looked at her in the way he had started to occasionally, not dismissively, not with warmth exactly, but with a kind of attention that was different from how he looked at most people. Like she was saying something that required actual processing. "Your mother works hard," he said. "That's why things work out." "She does work hard," Nia said, "but she was scared. And after I prayed, she wasn't scared as much. Even before the good stuff happened." She paused. "I think that's the part that matters first." Arthur picked up his document again, but his jaw was tighter than before, which Lena, watching from the kitchen window, recognized not as irritation, but as the particular expression of a man encountering something he doesn't have a clean answer for. Victor had been arriving more frequently, 3 times in the past 2 weeks, always with fresh documents, always with the same smooth, unhurried energy that Lena had learned to read as pressure in a good suit. The visits were never hostile in tone. Victor was too careful for that, but each one left the house with a different atmosphere than before. A kind of tightening, like a string being incrementally tuned. During the most recent visit, Lena had been in the hallway outside the sitting room, reorganizing the shelf near the doorway, when she heard Victor say, "The board is getting anxious. You need to be seen as capable of directing transition, not just operations." "Arthur, I am capable, of course. But the optics. I don't care about optics." Victor's voice dropped. "You should, especially now." A pause. "Sign the restructuring documents, Arthur. It protects you. It protects the company. It keeps the right people confident." Silence. "Then, Arthur, leave the documents. I'll look at them." Lena moved away from the shelf before Victor came out. She thought about it later when she was driving Nia home. She thought about the phrase "the right people" and what it was supposed to reassure and what it actually revealed. She had been around enough wealthy households to know the difference between a friend managing a situation and a predator managing an opening. She said nothing to Nia about this. But that night, she lay awake longer than usual. Arthur was alone past midnight. This wasn't unusual. He slept poorly, had since the accident, though he'd told no one. He would read for a while, work for a while, and eventually the night would reach an hour where even work felt hollow, and he was left with just the silence and the dark and the weight of everything he couldn't do anything about. Tonight, he'd wheeled himself to the large window at the end of the hallway, the one that overlooked the back garden. There was no moon. The garden was just shapes and shadows, the oak tree a large dark outline, the stone path invisible beneath it. He sat there for a long time. He was thinking about Klein's words, about the clinic in Switzerland, and the particular kind of finality in the specialist's eyes there, a different doctor, different continent, same expression. He was thinking about his legs, which had become objects he carried rather than parts of himself. He was thinking about the documents Victor kept bringing and something in his gut that refused to fully settle about them, though he couldn't yet articulate why. He was thinking about a lot of things at once, which was how he usually thought, information processed in parallel and efficiently. And then all of it stopped. He was staring at the dark garden, and he said it, not planned, not performed, just said it, the way something slips out when you've been holding it in long enough and the hour is right and there's no one to hear. If anyone's listening, his voice came out rougher than he expected. He stopped, cleared his throat, started again, quieter. If anyone is actually listening to any of this, I'd give anything. I would give anything to walk again. The night stayed exactly as it was. He sat there for another minute, feeling slightly foolish, which annoyed him, and then turned his chair around toward his room. He didn't notice the small figure standing at the far end of the hall. Nia had woken up thirsty. Lena had stayed late, finishing a job in the East Wing, and they were spending the night in the small guest room the staff occasionally used during extended work periods, an arrangement that happened sometimes and didn't require explanation. Nia had gotten up for water, found the kitchen, and was on her way back when she saw the light from the hall window and the shape of Arthur's chair silhouetted in it. She had stood still. She had heard him. Not every word. She was too far, but enough. The rough quality of his voice. The shape of his sentence. When he turned his chair and came toward the hall, she pressed herself gently into the doorway of the linen closet. He passed without seeing her, his face looking something she had not seen it look before. Tired in a deeper way than tired, the kind she recognized from her mother on certain nights when the worrying had been going on too long. She stayed in the doorway for a minute after he passed. Then she went back to the guest room, set her water cup on the nightstand, and lay back down. She stared at the ceiling. She was 7, almost 8, but she was not confused about what she had heard. She had heard a man ask for help, and she knew what that meant because she had done it herself in the dark in the same voice that tried not to sound like asking. She thought about it for a long time before she slept. She found him the next afternoon. The weather was mild, and he was in the garden again, habit at this point. He was reading something or pretending to. Nia came and sat on the bench nearby. She let a few minutes pass. Then she said, "Mr. Whitmore, if you really believe, like really, not just saying it, I'll pray with you." He looked up from the paper. His expression shifted through several things quickly. "What did you say?" "I said I'll pray with you, if you want, for your legs." He looked at her for a long moment. "How old are you?" He stopped. "You weren't in the hall last night." Nia said nothing. Arthur set the paper down slowly. Something moved through his expression. Not anger, not dismissal. Something more complicated than either. "You think I would do anything?" he said. His voice came out differently than usual. Quieter. Not dismissive. Not yet. Nia shrugged her small shoulders. "I think it does things. Not always the things you expect." He looked at her. Then he said it like a man who doesn't believe but is tired of believing nothing. "Fine. Heal my legs, and I'll give you half my inheritance." He meant it partly as a deflection, a way of framing the thing at a distance he could manage, making it conditional and absurd and therefore safe. Nia looked at him steadily. She did not smile at the wealth part. She did not react to it all. She simply said, "I don't want your money. I want you to be okay." A long silence. Arthur looked out at the garden, the oak tree, the path he could no longer walk. He looked for a long time. Then he said, very quietly, "So what do we do?" Nia got up from the bench and walked over to his chair. She stood beside him and reached out her small hand. He stared at it for a moment. A hand the size of his palm, a 7-year-old's hand, with a faded ink stamp on the back from some school activity, waiting. He took it. He closed his eyes. Not confidently, not with any particular feeling that something was about to change. Just closed them, because the night had been long and the doors had run out, and somewhere in the body of Arthur Whitmore, worn down to something quieter than ambition, there was a part that was willing to stop controlling just one thing. Nia bowed her head beside him, and in the late afternoon, in a garden that had seen every version of this man, she prayed. The days after the prayer were ordinary ones. The sun came up. The staff arrived. Arthur's physiotherapist came on Monday and Wednesday and moved his legs through their prescribed range while Arthur stared at the ceiling and answered emails on his phone. Victor called twice. Dr. Klein sent a follow-up summary of her last appointment that Arthur read and then deleted. Nothing changed, and yet it was difficult to name at first. Even Arthur couldn't have told you what was different, because the difference wasn't located in anything measurable. His legs were exactly as they had been. The chair was still there every morning, waiting beside the bed like a piece of furniture that had become part of his identity without his permission. He still couldn't stand. He still couldn't walk down the garden path or climb the stairs or do the 100 unremarkable things he'd done every day of his life before the accident without once stopping to be grateful for them. But the sharpness had softened just slightly. Mrs. Prescott noticed first. She mentioned it to no one, but she noticed the morning he let her correct a scheduling error without cutting her off. The afternoon he asked one of the kitchen staff how her son's exam had gone. Small things. The kind of things that are invisible unless you've been watching for them. Lena noticed too. She said nothing about it to Nia, but she watched. Nia kept coming. She didn't make it a ceremony. She arrived when she arrived, found Arthur when she found him, and settled nearby the way a cat settles, without announcement, without demand. She'd ask a question or two, or sometimes say nothing at all. She brought her notebook. Sometimes she drew. Sometimes she read the short chapter books she carried in her backpack. Arthur had stopped pretending this bothered him. One Tuesday, she sat beside a chair in the garden and said, "You seem different." He didn't look up from his book. Different how? Less like a storm. A pause. "I'm exactly the same. My mama says people say that when they're changing and don't want to admit it yet." He turned a page. "Your mother says a lot of things. She's usually right." He didn't argue with that, which was itself a kind of confirmation. On a Thursday afternoon, a little more than 2 weeks after the prayer in the garden, Arthur told her something he hadn't told anyone. They had been quiet for a while, the comfortable kind of quiet that had started to exist between them. Then Arthur set down the document he was reviewing and looked at the oak tree for a moment. "The accident happened the same night I found out someone had been working against me," he said. Not to Nia specifically, more into the air. "For a long time. Someone I trusted." Nia looked at him. She didn't speak. "I found something that day. Evidence of it. I was going to deal with it the next morning." He paused. "I never got to the next morning." Nia was quiet for a second. Then, "Is that why you're angry all the time? Not just the legs." Arthur looked at her. The directness of it, not mean, just exact, landed somewhere real. "Partly," he said. "Who was it?" He shook his head once. "That's not something I'm going to tell a 7-year-old. 7 3/4. That doesn't help." Nia looked back at her notebook. "You should probably figure out, though," she said simply, "so it doesn't stay stuck in you." Arthur said nothing, but he looked at the tree for a long time after that. Lena found Nia near the garden door that afternoon and pulled her aside quietly. "You're spending a lot of time near him," she said, keeping her voice low. Her eyes moved toward the garden and then back to her daughter. "We talk sometimes. I know what you're doing, Nia." Lena crouched to her daughter's level. Her face was careful, not angry, but carrying the weight of something Nia was still too young to fully read. "He's not a project. Rich people, powerful people, they aren't safe the same way. You understand?" Nia looked at her steadily. "He's just a person, Mama." "He's not just a person. He's a man with enemies and lawyers and things happening around him that are bigger than you know." "I know he's sad," Nia said. Lena looked at her for a moment. Then she stood and smoothed the front of her apron. "Just be careful," she said. "Stay near the kitchen side." Nia nodded. She did not say she would stop going to the garden. Victor arrived on a Friday, later than usual. He was carrying a leather portfolio this time, and he moved through the house with an impatience that was new, or perhaps newly visible. Lena crossed paths with him near the study hallway and felt the shift in his manner, the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. He smiled at her, but it was thinner than before. In the study, the conversation was short. Lena only heard fragments. She wasn't trying to hear it all today and had moved away deliberately. But she caught Victor's voice lifting slightly at one point, the careful smoothness slipping just at the edge. "Arthur, you are running out of time to do this on your terms." And then Arthur's voice, even, "I'm aware of time." When Victor left, he walked past Lena without nodding. He went straight to the front door, put on his own coat, and was gone. Lena looked at the closed door for a moment. Then she went back to work. It happened on a Sunday night. Arthur had dismissed his evening attendant early. He did this sometimes when he wanted the house quiet. He'd moved himself to the window seat in the upstairs study, which had a lower ledge he could park close to, and he'd been reading without really reading for about an hour. The house was still. Outside, a low wind moved through the garden. He was not thinking about his legs when he felt it. He was thinking about the conversation with Nia, the fragment about the accident, about betrayal, turning it over the way he sometimes did with business problems, looking for the part he'd missed. And in the middle of that, not trying, not concentrating, his right foot moved. Not just a flicker, not the kind of involuntary micro-twitch that Klein had already dismissed in the past. His toe bent down, held, and came back up. Arthur went completely still. He looked at his foot. He stared at it the way you stare at something that has done something impossible. Not in joy, not yet, but in the absolute blankness of a mind that has received information it does not have a category for. He tried again, deliberately this time. The toe moved. He pressed both hands flat on his thighs. His breathing had changed, slower, harder, like his lungs were trying to process something larger than air. He looked at the window, at the dark garden, at the oak tree barely visible in the distance. Then he looked back at his foot. "That's," he said. He stopped. He tried again. "That's impossible." The word came out quietly. Not a protest. Not disbelief exactly. Just a man whose whole architecture had been built on the principle that things either were or were not. And encountering, for the first time in 18 months, evidence that the line between those two states was not as fixed as he had built his life around believing. He sat in the dark for a long time after that, not calling anyone, not reaching for his phone, just sitting with it. He didn't tell Dr. Klein. He tested it again the next morning, sitting on the edge of the bed before his attendant arrived. Both toes this time, then a slow flex of his right foot, maybe 30% of what a normal flex would be, but present, real. He tested it carefully, methodically, the way he evaluated anything, gathering data before drawing conclusions. And then he covered it, swung himself into the chair, arranged his expression, and let the day proceed normally. He didn't know why he hid it. Not fully. Some part of it was superstition. The fear that speaking a fragile thing too early would break it, that Klein's skeptical dissection would reduce this to noise before he understood what it was. Some part of it was simpler. He didn't trust the people around him, yet with something this significant. Not with Victor circling. Not with documents and signed. Not until he understood more. So he kept it to himself and watched his own legs like a man reading a private message. Dr. Klein came Wednesday. The assessment was the same as always: passive range of motion, reflex testing, neural response evaluation. Arthur lay on the therapy table and answered the prompts the way he always did, moving what he'd always moved. He did not demonstrate the toe flex. He answered Klein's questions about sensation changes with a flat, nothing new. Klein noted something on his tablet. "You seem less agitated than last time," he offered. "I slept better. That's worth tracking. Sleep quality impacts neural inflammation, which can affect." "I know," Arthur said. "Are we done?" Klein looked at him for a moment. Then he closed his tablet. "I want to schedule a scan for next month. Just a baseline update." "Fine," Arthur said. "Schedule it." Klein left. Arthur waited until the front door closed, then sat in the quiet of the study and flexed both feet slowly, watching them alone. He told Nia, not because she was the logical choice, not because a 7-year-old was the appropriate confidant for a billionaire with a secret about his own body. He told her because she was the only person in the house who he had started to trust with the parts of himself that didn't perform. She arrived on Thursday with her mother, settled on the garden bench while Lena worked, and was drawing something with great concentration when Arthur rolled up beside her. Something happened, he said. She looked up. He looked at her steadily. Then he looked at his foot, and he moved his toes, slowly, deliberately, the full flex. Nia watched. She didn't gasp. She didn't grab his arm or start crying. She looked at his foot for a moment, and then she looked at his face. See, she said quietly. It's working. The simplicity of it should have annoyed him. Instead, it landed somewhere still and certain. I don't know what it is, he said. It might be. It's working, she said again. Not louder. Just again. Patient. Arthur looked at the oak tree. Don't tell anyone, he said. I know, Nia said, and she went back to drawing. Victor brought lawyers on Friday. 2 of them, associates from a firm Arthur recognized, men who specialized in the kind of corporate restructuring that required very careful language and very few questions. Victor introduced them in the front hall with the easy manner of someone who believed the meeting had already been decided. Just a preliminary review, he told Arthur. The documents are in good shape. This should take an hour. I didn't agree to a meeting, Arthur said. You didn't say no. Victor smiled. I thought we'd move things along while you had a good week. Arthur looked at the 2 lawyers, who were both looking at their briefcases. Then he looked at Victor. Something in his face had shifted since the tone moved. Not visible to most, but if you were watching carefully, something behind his eyes was different. Slower, more deliberate. Leave the documents, he said. I'll have my own counsel review them first. Victor's smile held. Of course. That's completely reasonable. He nodded to the lawyers, who were already recalibrating their posture. We'll set something up next week. They left. Arthur stayed in the front hall for a moment after the door closed, and then called a number he hadn't called in over a year. His name was Thomas Graves, not a lawyer, not an investigator officially. He was a man Arthur had used before, years ago, for situations that required thorough and discreet work. He'd been recommended by someone who no longer worked in the industry, which was itself a recommendation. Graves asked no unnecessary questions and delivered what he found. Arthur gave him 3 things: the accident date, the name of the company that had serviced the car 3 weeks prior, and a request for any financial records tied to both. How far back? Graves asked. As far as you need. Timeline, quick as you can. Graves said he'd be in touch. Arthur hung up and sat for a long time looking at the surface of his desk. He had not let himself think about the accident as anything other than what the report said. Mechanical failure, freak event, bad luck. Because the alternative required a conclusion he hadn't been prepared to sit with while he was still learning to live in a chair. But something about Nia's voice, so it doesn't stay stuck in you, had loosened a door he'd kept sealed. He let it open now, just slightly. Graves called back in 6 days. Arthur had the call on speaker in the study with the door closed. He listened without interrupting. Graves spoke in the flat, factual cadence of a man delivering information rather than opinion. The car service company had a financial connection, indirect, layered through 2 shell entities, to a holding firm Arthur recognized, one that had appeared in Victor's orbit before. The accident report had been signed off by an assessor with a 3-year working relationship with an insurance carrier that Victor sat on the advisory board of. The steering column failure had been assessed on site, with no independent review requested, and the car had been processed within 48 hours, unusually fast. Alone, each point meant little. Together, they told a story. That's everything so far, Graves said. You want me to go deeper? Yes, Arthur said. All of it. Every connection. Document it. He ended the call and sat in the study. His chest was doing something that was hard to categorize. Not rage, not yet. Something colder. The feeling of a man who has been standing in the wrong picture for 18 months and has finally stepped back far enough to see the frame. He thought about Victor in the front hall, smiling with those 2 lawyers. I thought we'd move things along. He thought about the documents. Restructuring. Control transfer. Protecting Arthur's interests. He thought about the phrase Nia had accidentally overheard, timing and insurance, and the chill of it, heard now in a completely different light. He saw Victor at the end of that week. Victor had dropped by without a full appointment, as he often did, to check on the document timeline. He appeared in the doorway of the sitting room, where Arthur was positioned near the window, and he leaned against the frame with the easy comfort of a man on his own ground. "Any movement on the council review?" Victor asked. Arthur looked at him. He had been practicing this, keeping his face exactly as it had been for the past 18 months. Tired, controlled, defeated at the edges. "Still in progress," he said. Victor nodded slowly. His eyes moved across Arthur. The chair, the position, the stillness. "You look tired," he said. Something in his voice that could be read as concern and was not. "I'm fiend." Victor pushed off the doorframe. "Well, don't take too long. The board is patient, but patience has a shelf life," Arthur said. "You've mentioned." Victor smiled. "I just want what's best for the company. For you." Arthur held the smile for exactly long enough. "I know you do." Victor left. Arthur waited until the car pulled out of the drive. Then he looked down at his hands, which had been perfectly still on the armrests throughout the exchange. He flexed his feet, both of them, slowly. A private confirmation. Then, into the empty room, he said it quietly. Not for anyone, just for himself. "You should have finished the job." The morning after Victor left, Arthur sat in the study with the door locked and his phone face down on the desk. He had been awake since 4. Not the restless, bitter wakefulness of the past 18 months. This was different. Focused. The kind of alertness that comes not from anxiety, but from clarity when a man who has spent a long time reacting finally shifts into deciding. He looked across the room at Victor's leather portfolio, still sitting on the side table where it had been left 3 visits ago. Clean edges. Gold clasp. The kind of object that communicated authority before it was ever opened. Arthur had not touched it. He pulled it toward him now. Opened it. Read every page slowly. The language was careful, legally sound, constructed to appear protective. Words like transition arrangement and authorized management continuity and in the event of incapacity. That last phrase appeared 4 times. Arthur counted. Each instance was phrased slightly differently, but the meaning was the same. If Arthur could not direct the company, for any reason, Victor stepped in. Fully, not temporarily. The language describing reversal conditions was present but buried, written in a way that made reversal technically possible and practically unlikely. Arthur closed the portfolio. He sat back and looked at the ceiling. Then he called his personal attorney. Not the firm Victor used, not the lawyers who had been arriving with briefcases and careful smiles. A woman named Carol Hartley, who had drafted Arthur's original company structure 15 years ago and had never once tried to expand her role in his life beyond what he asked for. She answered on the second ring. "I need you to review something," Arthur said. "Today, if possible." "I can be there by noon," she said. "Come through the east entrance. And don't mention this to anyone." A pause. "That's serious?" "Read it first," he said. "Then tell me what you think." Alone after the call, he locked the door again. He moved his chair to the center of the room, away from the desk, away from the walls. Then he placed both hands flat on the armrests, and he tried. His legs were not ready to stand. He knew that. He wasn't asking them to stand. He was asking them to confirm that what had been happening over the past week was not a fluke, not wishful sensation, not the psychological noise Klein had once dismissed. He pushed his weight forward slightly, letting his arms take most of it, and felt, faint but unmistakable, both feet pressing down in response. Not bearing weight, not capable of that yet, but present, participating. He released the breath he'd been holding. His arms were shaking slightly from the effort of the lean. He sat back and pressed his palms to his thighs. The right leg had a faint warmth to it, or maybe he was imagining that. It was hard to know what was real sensation and what was the mind filling in blanks it had been denied for too long. Either way, both toes, both feet, a lean forward. Something was building. "This is real," he said quietly to the empty room. Nia arrived that afternoon with Lena and found him in the garden. She came and sat nearby, reading one of her chapter books, and for a while neither of them spoke. The garden was mild and still. Somewhere in the oak tree, two birds were involved in a disagreement. After a while, Arthur said, "If I walk again, everything changes." Nia looked up from her book. She considered this in the way she considered most things, fully, without rushing to respond. "Then you should decide what kind of man you'll be when you do," she said. He looked at her. She had gone back to her book. He turned back to the garden and sat with that for a long time. He was not accustomed to being redirected by anyone, let alone a child. But the thing about Nia's observations was that they didn't arrive as challenges. They arrived as plain facts, the way a compass works. No agenda. Just direction. What kind of man? He had been a particular kind of man before the accident. Effective. Relentless. Willing to cut what needed to be cut without looking too long at what fell. He had built something real, and he had done it in ways that he would not, if pressed, fully defend. He knew this. He had filed it somewhere behind the work and let the work cover it. The accident had stripped the work away, left only the filing cabinet. He was not sure he wanted to open it, but he was beginning to understand that he would have to. Victor brought lawyers again on Tuesday. 3 this time, and a notary, a woman with a rigid expression and a stamp she kept in a velvet pouch. They assembled in the front sitting room without being asked to sit, standing near the window with their briefcases in a way that was meant to communicate inevitability. Victor presented the visit as a courtesy. "We're just here to finalize. Clean and simple. Then everything is protected and we all move forward." Arthur sat at the center of the room in his chair, looking at each of them in turn. "I like my counsel present," he said. Victor's expression stayed smooth, but something behind it adjusted. "That's your right. But it does slow. Schedule it with Carol Hartley's office," Arthur said. "She'll find a time." The notary put her stamp back in its pouch. The lawyers looked at Victor. Victor smiled the smile that had stopped reaching his eyes several visits ago. "Of course," he said. "We'll coordinate." They left. Arthur stayed in the sitting room after the door closed, and he permitted himself the small private satisfaction of watching them go. Victor found Lena in the hallway that afternoon. He had sent the lawyers ahead, told them he'd forgotten something, which was not true. He came back through the side corridor and stepped into Lena's path near the linen closet, his hands in his coat pockets, his expression carrying the particular warmth of a man who has decided to deliver a threat in a friendly tone. "You've been here a while now," he said. Lena held the folded towels in her arms and looked at him. "Almost 2 years. Good position. Stable house. Not easy to find something like this." He let that sit for a moment. "I understand your daughter comes sometimes. Well, I don't have childcare, yes." He nodded slowly. "She's been spending time near Arthur. She stays out of the way." Victor tilted his head. "I'm sure she does. I'm just thinking, it's a complicated house. Complicated situation. For a child." Another pause. "You wouldn't want things to become uncomfortable for your family." Lena looked at him. She kept her voice even. "Was there something you needed, Mr. Hale?" He smiled. "Just checking in." He patted the door frame once as he turned. "Take care of yourself, Lena." She stood in the hallway after he left, holding the towels, not moving. She waited until she heard the front door. Then she set the towels on the shelf and walked to the kitchen and stood at the sink and turned on the cold water and held her wrists under it for a moment, the way she did when she needed to stay level. Her hands were steady, but her chest was not. That evening, she found Nia at the kitchen table and sat across from her. "We might need to stop coming here," Lena said quietly. Nia looked up from her notebook. "What?" "The man with the coat talked to me today." Nia's expression shifted in a way Lena recognized. Not fear, but the careful, reading look she got when she was processing something significant. "What did he say?" "He said things that weren't threats, but were." Lena folded her hands on the table. "I need you to understand that this house has things going on that are bigger than Mr. Whitmore's legs. Things that could affect us if we stay too close." Nia was quiet. Then, "He needs us right now, Mama. I know you believe that. Something's happening. He's getting better. I haven't told anyone because he asked me not to, but..." She stopped. Lena looked at her. "What do you mean he's getting better?" Nia pressed her lips together. Then she said, "He's moving his feet. He showed me. He told me to keep it secret." Lena sat back in the chair. She was quiet for a long moment, her eyes going to the window and then back to her daughter. She thought about Victor in the hallway, about the lawyers, about the notary with the velvet pouch. She thought about what it would mean if Arthur was recovering, and Victor didn't know. "Okay," she said finally. She said it slowly, like a woman revising a decision she'd already made once. "We stay a little longer. But Nia," she leaned forward, "you stay near me. You hear me?" "Yes, Mama." Near me. Graves delivered the complete file on Thursday. It arrived by courier in a sealed envelope addressed to Arthur personally, marked with only Graves' initial in the corner. Arthur read it in the study with the door locked, starting at the beginning and going through to the end without stopping. It was thorough. The financial connections between Victor's holding entities and the service company that had worked on Arthur's car. Payments made in the 6 weeks preceding the accident to a mechanical consultant with a criminal record in 2 states, later scrubbed from public records, but not fully. An insurance payout that had gone not to Arthur, but to a corporate account structured under Victor's advisory access. A legal document, drafted but never executed, that would have transferred a significant portion of company control to Victor within 30 days of Arthur being deemed permanently incapacitated. The document had been drafted 11 days before the accident. Arthur sat with that number for a long time. 11 days. Victor had not been improvising. He had prepared. He had planned for an outcome, and then he had arranged for that outcome to occur, and then he had arrived at the hospital with flowers and a carefully constructed expression and said the right things to the right people while Arthur was still learning that he could no longer feel his legs. Arthur set the file down on the desk. He looked at the wall. He was not a man given to visible emotion, and he did not allow himself visible emotion now. But something inside him had gone very quiet in the way that things go quiet when they have been fully and finally confirmed. The noise of uncertainty was gone. What remained was just truth, clear and cold and heavy as stone. He picked up the file again and locked it in the desk drawer. Then he called Carol Hartley. "I need you to prepare a counter document," he said. "And I need to send some materials to someone in law enforcement. Discreetly. Tonight." Carol's voice was careful. "Arthur, how serious is this?" He looked at the desk drawer. "Serious enough," he said. The signing ceremony was announced on Friday morning. Victor sent a formal message, calendar invite, full distribution, the kind of communication that presents a decision as already made. All relevant parties. 2 days out. The language was professional and warm and absolute. Finalization of restructuring documentation. Attendance requested. Arthur read it at his desk. He noted the date. He noted the 2-day window. Then he looked at his legs. He moved them. Both feet, slow flex. Right ankle, a rotation now, weak but deliberate. He leaned forward in the chair, hands on the armrests, and pushed. His arms shook. His back strained. He got halfway upright, legs trembling beneath him, weight shifting on a feet that hadn't carried anything in 18 months. And then his legs gave, and he dropped back into the chair. He sat breathing hard. His arms were burning. His legs felt like they belonged to someone else, borrowed and unreliable and shot through with a strange electric ache that was completely different from the numbness of before. He stared at the garden through the window. Then, slowly, a sound came out of him that was almost a laugh. "You should have finished the job," he said. And he meant it as Victor would never want it to be meant. Not as defeat, but as the particular satisfaction of a man who has just confirmed he still has something left. 2 days. He looked at the calendar. He looked at his legs. The morning of the signing ceremony arrived gray and still. By 9 o'clock, cars were already pulling into the Whitmore Estate Drive. Lawyers came first, 4 of them, different firms, all assembled by Victor to present the appearance of comprehensive oversight. Then executives, 2 board members who had been given a version of events that was true in its facts and misleading in its architecture. Then the notary, back with her velvet pouch, moving through the front entrance with the practiced efficiency of a woman who attended these events regularly and found them unremarkable. The house transformed. Tables were set up in the main drawing room. Documents laid out in sequence. Water glasses arranged. Coffee brought in. A small arrangement of white flowers placed at the center of the table that no one had asked for and no one removed. The room had been used for dinners and occasional business meetings, but today it felt different. Not like a room being used, but like a room being taken. Victor arrived at 9:30 and moved through it all with the ease of a man walking through his own house. He greeted the lawyers by name, spoke briefly with the board members, checked the document sequence. He was wearing a dark suit and a light expression, the expression of a man for whom today represented the completion of a long project. Evelyn Whitmore arrived at 10. She came through the front entrance without having been announced, which meant someone on staff had let her in without checking, or she had simply walked in, which was more likely. She was in her late 30s, lean, with her father's eyes and something harder around the mouth. She had not been to the estate in over a year. She had not spoken to Arthur in longer than that. Victor greeted her at the drawing room door with particular warmth. "Evelyn, I'm glad you came. I wanted to see it," she said. Her voice was even uninflected. "Of course." He gestured toward the room. "You should." She looked around at the assembled lawyers, the documents, the water glasses. Something crossed her face that was difficult to read. Satisfaction, maybe, or something that had once been satisfaction and had started to feel slightly different in the light of the actual room. She sat near the back wall, away from the table, and said nothing. Lena had been in the kitchen since 7. She moved through her work with the controlled efficiency of someone who has decided to stay present in their body rather than in their worry. She washed, folded, reorganized the pantry shelf that didn't need reorganizing. She checked on Nia every 20 minutes. By mid-morning, Nia had moved from the kitchen table to the hallway bench near the drawing room entrance. Lena found her there and pulled her up by the hand. "Come back to the kitchen," she said. "I want to stay." "Nia, Manga." Nia looked at her, direct, calm, 7 years old, and completely certain. "I have to be here today." Lena looked at her daughter for a long moment. Then she looked at the drawing room door, at the sound of low professional voices and the shuffle of papers. She thought about what Nia had told her, about the feet moving, about 2 days. She let out a slow breath. "You stay against the wall," she said. "You don't speak. You don't move until I say." Nia nodded. Lena stood beside her, and they waited together, Lena's hand resting on her daughter's shoulder, both of them watching the door. Arthur was brought in at 10:15. He appeared in the drawing room doorway, in his chair, pushed by his morning attendant. He was wearing a dark gray suit, the kind he used to wear to board meetings before, and his expression was the expression Lena had come to recognize as his performance face, controlled, slightly exhausted, a man managing something heavy. He looked exactly as Victor needed him to look. Victor moved forward to greet him. "Arthur, thank you for being here." Arthur looked at the room, at the lawyers, at the documents laid out on the table, at Evelyn, sitting in the back, who looked at him with an expression that was almost defiant and almost something else. He looked at her for a moment. Then he moved himself toward the head of the table. "Let's get this done," he said. Victor stood at the side of the table and began walking through the documents, calmly, methodically, the practiced voice of a man who had rehearsed this. He explained each section with the language of someone protecting Arthur's interests. He named the board members who supported the arrangement. He cited timeline pressures. He used words like legacy and stability and long-term security with the particular fluency of someone who had decided what those words meant long before anyone else was in the room. Arthur sat at the head of the table. He did not look at the documents. He looked at Victor. At the back of the room, Nia sat against the wall, her hands folded in her lap. Her head was slightly bowed. Her lips were moving, barely. Not words anyone could hear, just the faintest motion, the private language of a child who had learned to carry things quietly. Lena stood beside her, hand still on her shoulder, watching. Victor finished his presentation. He picked up the pen from beside the first document and held it out toward Arthur. He leaned in slightly. His voice dropped. Not enough for the lawyers to hear clearly, but enough to carry the weight of what he meant. "You should have stayed down," he said. The room was very still. Arthur looked at the pen. He looked at Victor's hand holding it. He looked at Victor's face, the smooth certainty of it, the careful warmth that had been covering something cold for a very long time. And then Arthur Whitmore put both hands on the edge of the table. The room didn't understand, at first what they were watching. His arms pushed, his jaw tightened, his shoulders, those arms that had carried everything for 18 months, pulled and pressed and held. And slowly, with a trembling that was visible to every person in the room, Arthur Whitmore began to rise. It was not elegant. It was not the smooth, confident standing of a man who had never lost anything. It was hard and shaking and slow, the kind of rising that costs something real, that draws on reserves built in the dark when no one is watching. His legs trembled violently beneath him. His knuckles were white on the table edge. His face was a controlled storm. But he rose. He stood, not fully upright. He was leaning forward, both hands still gripping the table, his legs barely holding, the trembling visible throughout his body. But his feet were on the floor. His weight was his own. He was standing in the same room as the man who had put him in a chair, and he was standing on his own. The room froze. One of the lawyers dropped his pen. The notary stepped back. The two board members looked at each other and then looked away, as if eye contact might implicate them. Evelyn's hand came up to her mouth. Victor stepped back. His face went through something complicated and very fast. Disbelief, recalculation, and underneath both of those, the specific fear of a man who has just watched his central assumption collapse. Arthur looked at him. He was breathing hard. His legs were shaking. He had perhaps another 30 seconds before they gave out. He used them. "You try to bury me alive," he said. His voice came out rough and completely steady at the same time. The 30 seconds ran out. His legs gave, and he gripped the table and lowered himself back into the chair. Not a collapse, a controlled descent, a man choosing to sit rather than fall. He sat back and breathed. The room remained frozen. Evelyn had stood up from her chair at the back. She was still standing, her hands still at her mouth, her eyes moving between her father and Victor with an expression that was no longer difficult to read. Something in it had cracked open. Victor had recovered his face somewhat. He took a half step forward. "Arthur, this doesn't. Don't." Arthur's voice was flat and absolute. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. He removed a folded set of documents, not thick, but substantial, and placed them on the table in front of the nearest lawyer. Then he placed a second set beside them, a recording device. Small, digital, the kind used in business meetings. "The first set," Arthur said, "is from an independent investigation into the circumstances of my accident 18 months ago. Financial records, service company connections, a consultant with a sealed criminal record, and a control transfer document drafted 11 days before my car steering column was tampered with." He looked around the table. "The second is a recording of the conversation in this room approximately 4 minutes ago." He looked at Victor. "Including what you just said to me." The silence was of a different quality now. Not the silence of a room frozen in surprise. The silence of a room understanding something. Victor's face had gone a particular color. "This is," he started. "Evidence has already been sent," Arthur said. "Law enforcement received it this morning. The lawyers who prepared these counter documents are already on record." He looked at the lawyers Victor had brought. "If I were you, I would speak to separate counsel before this afternoon." 2 of Victor's lawyers were already reaching for their phones. The third was looking at the exit. Victor made one last move. He straightened. He adjusted his jacket. He looked at Arthur with something that had abandoned warmth entirely, and he said, "You want to open up your past, Arthur? You want to put everything on the table? I know things about how you built this company that would end you. Things you did. Decisions you made." His voice had gone cold and precise. "You're not clean either." The room waited. Arthur looked at him for a long moment. "No," he said. "I'm not." He said it plainly, without defense. "I've made decisions I wouldn't make the same way now. I've hurt people I didn't take the time to see clearly. That's true. A breath. But it doesn't give you the right to destroy me. And it doesn't change what you did." The front door opened. 2 officers came through, accompanied by a man in a dark coat who spoke quietly to the nearest lawyer and showed documentation. Victor looked at them. He looked at Arthur. He looked at the room. Then he looked at Evelyn, who was still standing at the back, her arms folded now, her face wet without her having appeared to notice. She looked away from him. Victor was escorted out. The effort of standing had taken something real. As the room began to move, lawyers gathering documents, officers speaking in low voices, the board members finding reasons to be in other parts of the house. Arthur felt his body making its accounting. His legs had gone from trembling to a deep, bone-level ache. His arms were exhausted. His chest was doing something complicated that he couldn't fully categorize. He became aware of a small hand. Nia had crossed the room without anyone stopping her. Or perhaps no one had been watching her at all, and she was standing beside his chair with her hand held out. Not grabbing, not demanding. Just there. He looked at it for a moment. Then he took it. She held on without saying anything. Just stood there, her small hand in his, the way she had in the garden weeks ago, when none of this had been visible yet. He looked down at her. "You didn't just help me walk," he said. His voice came out quieter than he intended. "You made me see." Nia looked up at him. Her eyes were steady and very full. "I know," she said softly. And then, simply, "Are you okay?" He thought about the question seriously, the way it deserved. "Getting there," he said. Evelyn approached from across the room. She came slowly, the way people approach something they've been afraid of for a long time and have finally decided to stop avoiding. She stopped a few feet from his chair. Her arms were still folded, but the defiance was gone from her posture. What remained was something closer to a person. "I thought you deserved it," she said. Her voice was unsteady. "Everything that happened. I thought, the way you ran things, the way you treated people. I thought it was what you had coming." She stopped, swallowed. "I didn't know someone had planned it. I didn't know." Her voice broke slightly. "I was wrong." Arthur looked at his daughter, at the years in her face, at the things he'd put there and the things life had added and the things that were entirely her own. "I wasn't blameless," he said, "in how things were between us. I know that." She looked at him. "So what do we do with that?" He didn't have a clean answer. He was a man who had spent his whole life having clean answers, and he was learning that the most important questions didn't come with them. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I'd like to find out." Evelyn stood there for a moment longer. Then, carefully, she sat down in the chair nearest to him. Not embracing, not resolved, just sitting. It was for now enough. Arthur sat in the drawing room as it slowly emptied. The evidence gathered, the conversations concluded, the ordinary machinery of consequence beginning to turn. Nia had drifted back to Lena, who was standing near the doorway with her hand on her daughter's shoulder, watching Arthur with an expression that was careful and something else he would need to understand better later. He looked at his hands, then at his legs, then at the chair beneath him. He had stood today. He had stood in the same room as the man who had taken that from him, and he had stood on his own legs and said the thing that needed to be said. He was back in the chair now. That was still the truth. But it was a different chair than the one he'd been sitting in for 18 months. The same object, completely different meaning. He had chosen to sit down this time. The drawing room took 2 hours to clear. Officers moved through it methodically, bagging documents, photographing the table arrangement, speaking in low voices with the lawyers who had stayed, the ones who understood that their best option now was cooperation. 2 of Victor's lawyers had left quickly. The third had stayed and was speaking to a detective near the window, his briefcase open, looking like a man reconstructing a decision he wished he had made differently 6 months ago. Arthur remained at the head of the table through most of it, answering questions when asked, directing his own attorney, Carol Hartley, with brief nods and quieter instructions. He looked exhausted in a way that went past the physical, the kind of exhaustion that follows not exertion but release when something you have been bracing against for a long time finally stops pressing. Evelyn sat near the side wall, not leaving, not inserting herself, just present, watching. Carol approached Arthur at one point and leaned down. "They have enough," she said quietly. "The pre-drafted transfer document alone, 11 days before the accident, that's going to be very hard to explain away." "He'll try," Arthur said. "He will. He'll hire people who are very good at trying." She looked at him steadily. "But the recording seals the intent. That line, what he said to you before you stood, that's going to follow him." Arthur nodded once. He looked at the table where the documents had been laid out an hour ago, the careful language of a transfer that had almost happened. He thought about all the versions of this morning that could have existed. The one where he had signed, the one where his legs had never moved, the one where Nia had never wandered into the garden with her notebook and her patient, uncomplicated presence. He didn't say any of that. He said, make sure the financial trail goes into the full record. All of it. Every shell company. Already in motion, Carol said. Victor was in a holding facility across the city by early afternoon. He had said very little during the escort out. One moment, at the front door, turning back, he had looked at the room with an expression that was almost composed, the last effort of a man maintaining the performance even as the audience dispersed. He had looked at Arthur. Arthur had looked back. Nothing in his face moved. Victor had been walked to the car. Now, in the drawing room, one of the officers briefed Arthur on next steps, arraignment timeline, the scope of the fraud and conspiracy charges, the likelihood of additional counts once the full financial investigation was complete. Arthur listened and asked precise questions. He was familiar with the architecture of legal process from the other side. He understood timelines and exposure and the long, grinding patience required by serious consequence. When the officer finished, Arthur said, what happens if his lawyers argue the accident evidence is circumstantial? The officer looked at him carefully. That's for prosecutors to navigate. But the combination of the pre-drafted document, the financial connections, and the direct recording of today's statement, that's not a weak case. A pause. He knew what he was doing. People who plan things leave trails. Arthur looked at the table. Yes, he said. They do. The last of the official personnel left around 2 o'clock. Carol stayed another 30 minutes, going over immediate protective measures for the company, interim leadership protocols, a statement to the board, the communication strategy for the days ahead. She was thorough and calm and asked nothing personal, which was one of the reasons Arthur had trusted her for 15 years. When she left, the drawing room was empty except for Arthur, Evelyn, and the low afternoon light coming through the tall windows. Neither of them spoke immediately. Evelyn was standing near the window, looking out at the drive. Her arms were no longer folded. She had her hands in the pockets of her coat, and she looked smaller than she had when she'd arrived that morning. Not diminished, but as if some of the architecture she'd been carrying had come down. Arthur turned his chair toward her. You came because you wanted to watch it happen, he said. Not an accusation, just a statement. She turned from the window. Her jaw shifted slightly. Yes. And now? She looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon light caught the side of her face and showed the years in it, the ones that had accumulated since they'd last been in the same room without lawyers between them. She had her mother's cheekbones. Her mother had been gone for 12 years. It was a fact Arthur carried without speaking about. I thought you'd built what you built at the expense of everyone around you, she said. And I wasn't entirely wrong about that. She held his gaze. But I thought you'd arranged the accident. I thought, when I heard you were in a chair, that it was some kind of delayed consequence. The world finally balancing itself. Arthur absorbed that. He let it sit in the room without rushing past it. I made decisions that hurt people, he said, including you, including your mother. That's real, and I'm not going to sit here and reframe it. His hands rested still on his armrests. But I didn't stage my own paralysis as a character exercise. Something broke slightly in Evelyn's expression. Not fully. She was too composed for that, too practiced in the particular armor of someone who has spent years being the estranged one. But something shifted. I know that now, she said, quietly. Victor told you something different. She looked down briefly. He suggested. He never said directly. He's very careful about what he says directly. A pause. He told me you were trying to cut me out of the estate permanently, that the accident had made you bitter and that you were rewriting everything while you still could. She looked back up. I believed him because I wanted to. Arthur looked at his daughter, at the damage in her face and the pride and the grief and the anger that had no clean target anymore. I was bitter, he said. That part was true. I know. I made it easy for him to use you. Her eyes went sharp for a moment. Then they softened again, which cost her more than the sharpness had. We both made it easy, she said. Arthur nodded slowly. He looked at the window, at the drive outside, now empty, the afternoon going gray at the edges. I don't know how to do this, he said. Whatever this is between us, I don't know how to process for it. Evelyn let out a short sound that was almost a laugh. That's the first honest thing you've ever said to me. He looked at her. I'm working on it, he said. She stood at the window for another moment. Then she walked over and sat in the chair closest to him. Not touching, not resolved, but close. The same way she'd sat at the end of Act 6. Still just sitting. But this time something in the air between them was different. Not repaired. Not even close to repaired. But no longer pretending the damage wasn't there, which was its own kind of start. Arthur nearly fell. He had not told anyone about the depth of exhaustion that the standing had cost him. He had performed steadiness through the afternoon. The questions, the documentation, the conversation with Evelyn, and it had held because he had needed it to. But when his attendant finally wheeled him toward the east corridor and the house had gone quiet, the signal his body had been sending for hours arrived all at once. His vision blurred at the edges. His arms, which had gripped the table and held his weight and carried everything for 18 months and then one extraordinary standing, began to shake with a tremor that he could not stop. He heard a small voice. He needs to sit down somewhere soft. Nia. Not alarmed, just factual. He was aware of being guided. His chair moved, his attendant's hands steadying him, Lena appearing from somewhere with a glass of water. He was moved to the sitting room, the low couch, repositioned from the chair to the cushioned seat with the kind of practice care that had become ordinary in this house and which he had fought against for months before accepting. He sat. Nia was beside the couch, her arms slightly out, the posture of a child who cannot physically help but has positioned herself to try anyway. Her face was full, not crying, but very close to it, the expression of someone whose heart has been working very hard for a long time. He looked at her. He was not a man who said the important things easily. He had gone his entire adult life building structures of language around feelings rather than naming them directly. The business speak, the controlled delivery, the art of communicating without revealing. It had served him in boardrooms. It had cost him most of the things that mattered. You didn't just tell me walk, he said. Nia looked at him. You made me see, he said. Things I'd stopped letting myself look at. Things about who I was and what I owed to being a person, not just operating like one. He stopped, cleared his throat. You're 7 years old. You shouldn't know how to do that. 7 3/4, Nia said. Something in his chest broke loose that had been lodged there for a very long time. It came out as a laugh, a real one, rough and sudden and completely unperformed, the first one in 18 months that had not been private. 7 3/4, he said. Right. Nia moved forward and took his hand the way she had before, both hands around his one. She held it without saying anything else. She didn't need to. Lena stood in the doorway, watching. Her arms were folded, but gently. Not the armor of earlier, just the natural posture of a woman at rest, watching her daughter be exactly who she was. Evelyn came to the doorway a few minutes later and stopped. She looked at Nia, and then at Arthur, and then at Nia again. She had not met Nia properly before today, had seen her at the edges of the afternoon, a small, steady presence that had not fully registered until the moment she crossed the room to take Arthur's hand while the room was still processing what had just happened. She looked at Nia for a long moment, at the child who had been quietly in this house for months, showing up with her notebook and her impossible patience and her uncomplicated prayers. Evelyn's eyes went wet. She walked into the room. She sat in the chair across from the couch, and she looked at her father with his daughter's hands around his. I was wrong, she said. Her voice was stripped of its earlier composure entirely. I thought you deserved what happened to you. I told myself that for 18 months. And I was wrong. Arthur looked at her across the room. His daughter, 12 years of distance, and this afternoon, and everything in between. I know, he said. That's not enough for me. I know it isn't. It's a start. She pressed her lips together. She nodded once, very small. In a room that had been a battlefield that morning and was now just a room, they sat together. Evelyn at a distance, Nia close, Arthur in the middle, the day going quiet around them all. 6 weeks later, the physical therapy room had been set up in the East Wing at Carol Hartley's recommendation. She had suggested it as part of the broader restructuring of the estate's function, which was still ongoing, but the therapy room had been the first thing Arthur had approved. A mat, parallel bars, a balance board, equipment that was unremarkable in a medical facility and quietly extraordinary in a private home because of what it implied. Arthur worked with a therapist named Dr. Patricia Wells 3 mornings a week. She was direct and unhurried and did not offer false encouragement, which suited him. She noted progress without inflation. The right leg's strength was advancing ahead of the left by a margin that was meaningful but not yet decisive. His standing time had increased from 30 seconds to nearly 3 minutes with the bars. His balance was inconsistent but improving. His arms, which had been carrying everything for 18 months, were now learning to share the load. "You're ahead of where I'd have projected at this stage," Wells told him one Thursday morning, making a note on her tablet. Significantly. Is that unusual? She considered. In cases with this injury profile and this timeline since injury, yes. It's unusual. She looked at him. Whatever changed in the last couple of months, it's showing up in the work. Arthur looked at the parallel bars. He didn't explain what had changed. He didn't have language for it that would have made sense in a clinical context, and he was no longer in the business of needing things to make sense in clinical contexts. "Let's go again," he said. The story broke in the media on a Tuesday. Not from Arthur. He had not spoken to press, had no intention of doing so, and had instructed Carol's office to redirect all inquiries. But the arraignment proceedings were public record, and someone had connected the threads. The billionaire in the wheelchair, the business partner, the staged accident, the signing ceremony where Arthur Whitmore had stood up and delivered evidence that had been years in the making. The coverage was extensive and not entirely accurate, in the way that coverage rarely was when the real story was more complicated than the headline. Some outlets focused on Victor, the betrayal, the criminal charges, the long-running financial manipulation. Some focused on Arthur, the recovery, the standing, the dramatic confrontation. A few, the ones with better researchers, found the edges of the story that were harder to package. That Arthur Whitmore was not a simple victim, that the company he'd built had its own complicated history, that justice and heroism were not always the same category. Arthur read one piece. Then he closed the laptop. Nia's name was not in any of it. He had made sure of that. She was 7 years old, and the world did not need to know what she had done. That was between them. The lawyers raised the inheritance question on a Wednesday afternoon. Two of them, sitting across from Arthur in the study, with the careful expressions of people who had been told to bring up something sensitive. They had documents, not transfer documents, nothing like what Victor had brought, but estate planning revisions, beneficiary updates, the ordinary architecture of a man who has survived something and is putting his affairs in order. "There's a matter of record," the senior lawyer said. He was a careful man named Howard Bell, gray at the temples, the kind of lawyer who had seen enough to know that the strangest things ended up being legally significant. A verbal agreement made approximately 8 weeks ago, witnessed, informally, by a member of household staff. He set a paper on the desk. The terms as stated were, in exchange for healing of the lower limbs, half the estate. Arthur looked at the paper. He was quiet for a moment. "And your recommendation?" he asked. Bell shifted slightly. "Our recommendation is a structured approach. The stated beneficiary is a minor with no independent legal standing. A direct transfer of that scale to a child would require guardianship proceedings, tax planning, protection mechanisms." He paused. "It's complicated." "I didn't ask about the complications," Arthur said. "I asked for your recommendation." Bell looked at him. "Honor the spirit of it," he said simply. "Find a structure that does." Arthur nodded. "Leave the documents. I'll think about it." He thought about it for 3 days. He thought about it during his morning therapy sessions, the parallel bars under his hands, Wells calling out counts. He thought about it in the evenings in the garden, which he had started returning to, not in the wheelchair exclusively, but sometimes with a cane, sometimes with his attendant beside him, moving slowly along the stone path toward the oak tree in a way that was effortful and real and nothing like it had been before, but closer every week. He thought about Nia, about what the money would mean to her, not in the abstract, but specifically. A 7-year-old girl who had come to this house in her mother's wake, who had drawn plans in a notebook and asked questions that cut to the center of things, and prayed in a garden without asking for anything except for a man she barely knew to be okay. He thought about what half his estate would do to a life like hers, whether it would carry her or crush her, whether wealth given to a child was a gift or a burden, or simply a decision made by an adult who had not fully thought through what the child would carry it into. He thought about Lena, about what it meant to be a woman who had raised a daughter like Nia, what qualities of character and steadiness and deep, protective love that required, about the threat Victor had made in the hallway, about the 2 years Lena had moved through this house doing her work and managing her fear and keeping her daughter's faith alive and her own head level. He thought about what he actually had that was worth giving. By the third evening, sitting on the garden bench with his cane resting against the stone beside him, he had his answer. He found Nia in the kitchen the next morning. She was at the table with her notebook, a new one, the old one having been filled up sometime in the past weeks. She was drawing the parallel bars from the therapy room, which she had seen through the doorway once and apparently found architecturally interesting. Arthur came in with his cane and sat across from her. She looked up. "I need to talk to you about something," he said. "Okay," she said. She put down her pencil. "Do you know what half my inheritance means?" Nia considered this seriously. "A lot of money. A very large amount of money, yes." She looked at him. "You're going to say you're not going to give it to me. I'm going to say I'm going to do something different. And I want to explain why." He leaned forward slightly. "You asked me, on a day when I wasn't being a very good version of myself, if I'd ever asked for help. And then you sat with me in a garden and you did something I didn't have the vocabulary for. And I said something careless about money because I didn't have better language for what I actually meant." Nia was listening with her full attention, her hands folded on the notebook. "What I meant," he said, "was that whatever this thing was that you'd done, it was worth everything I had. That's what I was trying to say. In a very bad way." Nia looked at him for a moment. "I just wanted you to be okay," she said. "I know." He held her gaze. "That's exactly why I need to do this properly." He told Lena that afternoon. She was in the east corridor, folding linens, and she looked up when he came in with his cane. She had a way of reading rooms that Arthur had come to respect. She assessed everything and showed what she chose to show, which was usually very little until she was ready. He laid out plainly what he had decided, the structure of it, what it would require from her, and what it would mean. When he finished, Lena set down the linen she'd been folding. She looked at him for a long moment. Her expression moved through several things: surprise, then assessment, then something that was not quite suspicion but was in the same neighborhood. "You're going to need people around this who you trust," she said. "Yes. People who aren't going to manage it for what's in it for them. Also, yes." She picked up the linen again. She smoothed the crease along the edge with her thumb, slowly, thinking. Then she looked at him. "Why me?" she asked. Not modestly. She wanted the actual answer. Arthur gave it to her directly. "Because you've been in this house for 2 years with things happening around you that were dangerous, and you kept your head level and your daughter safe and your integrity intact. Because the man who tried to threaten you in the hallway is now facing criminal charges, and you didn't flinch when it counted." He looked at her steadily. "And because this is about families like yours, and you understand what that means from the inside, not from conference room." Lena was quiet for a moment. "I need to understand the structure fully," she said. "All of it, not summaries." "Of course. And I'd want independent counsel. My own, not yours. I'd expect nothing less." She looked at him for another long moment. Something settled in her expression, not entirely, not all at once, but the beginnings of a decision. "Let me read what you're proposing," she said. "Then we'll talk." The formal papers were drawn up over the following 2 weeks. The foundation was established under Nia's name. The Brooks Foundation. Carol Hartley had suggested something more elaborate, and Arthur had said no, keep it simple, keep it hers. Its purpose was the support of working families in financial hardship, emergency assistance, childcare access, education funding, the specific and practical kinds of help that made the difference between a family that made it and one that didn't. Not charity in the abstract. Tangible, specific, real. Lena was named executive director. She spent 3 weeks reading every document twice, meeting with her own attorney 4 times, asking questions that were sharp and thorough, and occasionally pointed in ways that made Carol Hartley write notes in the margins. She accepted on a Thursday, sitting across from Arthur in the study. "I wanted to actually help people," she said, "not function as a vehicle for anyone's reputation." "That's why you're running it," Arthur said. She nodded. "Once. And that was that." A significant portion of Arthur's estate was transferred into the foundation's endowment, structured, protected, managed for the long term. The remainder was restructured into a trust for Nia, legally sound, protected until her majority, with provisions that ensured it would carry her without overwhelming her. It was by any measure what he had promised, and also something larger than what he had promised, which was the only way Arthur Whitmore knew how to honor a debt. On a Saturday morning, for weeks after the foundation was established, the garden was quiet. The October light had come back, the same amber, sideways light that had been in the garden on the day Nia first found Arthur stuck on the flagstone seam, the day she had told him matter-of-factly how to clear the wheel. The oak tree held its last leaves. The stone path was dry. Arthur came down the garden path with his cane. He was not moving quickly. He would not move quickly for some time. Wells had been clear on that, and Arthur had accepted it with more patience than anyone who knew him would have predicted 6 months ago. He moved carefully, each step placed with full attention, the cane steady in his right hand, his body negotiating its own recovery in the honest, incremental way that things actually healed. No wheelchair. He reached the bench near the oak tree and stood beside it. He did not sit. He just stood there, in the garden, in the morning light, the way he had not stood in 18 months. Lena and Nia were there. Lena was standing near the garden door, her hands folded, watching with an expression that was composed and full at the same time. Nia was on the path between them, in her jacket with the sun and cloud patch, her notebook tucked under her arm. She looked at Arthur, standing by the bench. She looked at the path. She looked at the tree. She took it all in with the careful, comprehensive attention that had been her way from the beginning. Arthur looked at her. "You kept your promise," he said. He said it simply, the way the most important things needed to be said. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and took out a small envelope. Not dramatic, not ceremonial, just an envelope, the kind used for letters. He held out to her. "So I'm keeping mine." Nia took the envelope. She looked at it for a moment, then at him. "There are documents in there," he said. "They won't mean much to you right now. Your mother has copies of everything, and she understands all of it. But that envelope is yours. It says your name on the front, and everything inside it belongs to you." Nia turned the envelope over. Her name was written on the front in Arthur's handwriting. Firm, clean, the handwriting of a man who meant what he put on paper. She held it for a moment. Then she looked up at him. "I didn't do it for the money," she said. "I know," he said. "That's exactly why you get it." She smiled at that, small and certain. The smile of someone who has received a satisfying answer to a question they already knew. Then she looked at the garden around them, at the bench, at the oak tree, at her mother standing near the door, at Arthur standing on his own 2 feet in the morning light. "See," she said softly. He looked at her. "I told you," she said. "It would start small." Arthur stood in the garden with his cane and looked at the 7-year-old, 7 3/4, who had sat with him in this same garden when he had been a man running out of doors and had simply, without any particular drama, opened one more. "You did," he said. The oak tree held its last leaves in the October light. The stone path stretched out between them, dry and clear. Lena watched from the door, her expression its own kind of quiet fullness. And in the garden where it had all begun, the 3 of them stood in the morning together, no wheelchair in sight. If a child's quiet faith could reach a man who had stopped believing in everything, what has your pride been costing you in silence? If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe. More stories like this one are waiting for you.